Hello, everybody. My name is Sil the DM, and welcome to a slightly late um, Sands of Calimare Recap. It's a little late because with the coronavirus going on in China, I've been doing a lot of overtime at work, um, which includes on the weekends, and I'm supposed to be getting a new roommate this weekend, which required me to gut one of the rooms in the house and do a lot of furniture moving. And then the other day when I was gonna record it, I ended up slicing my hand open, and it's been a journey. So unfortunately, last week's recaps are a little late. Um, but we're gonna dive right in. We pick up directly where our players left off, sort of. They all ended up unconscious, being psionically assaulted by some bizarre creature they couldn't quite understand or see, and they began experiencing visions one by one. Riok picking up a time when they were in the desert, when they had dropped from Laputa to the desert below to Joram, traveling with a flock of aviacs. But everything in all of the visions, was wrong. The people's faces were blurred and just a scattered mess of details and lines, nothing that you could focus on. As Ryok spent time eating food and sitting and sort of viewing all of this, slowly those figures melted away until, in Ryok's memory, it was just them alone, surviving in the wilds, feasting on whatever they could manage. And eventually this faded away. Each of the players experienced a rather similar dream. Kieran experienced the start of the campaign, the quest in Rosmaran to try and earn enough money to pay their way um, to get on with the caravan with Ambar and Brazen. Um, but the people who'd help them in this quest, Sin, the the undercover agent of the Empire working in Rosmaran as a guard, who helped them, slowly faded away from Kieran's memories, as did a few other details of that encounter. Aesir remembered a time when they were in Darn's Canyon, the large gap which exists in the center of Jiram, um, that they took as a shortcut to get from Shangri Khan to Calimare, as it takes many, many weeks to walk around the canyon safely. And Aesir felt the memory of Magnus, the charismatic dwarven noble they traveled with for quite some time, drift further and further away. Nixandra remembered an earlier time traveling with her Minotaur bodyguard, and someone else, her brother. But throughout the course of the vision, the image of her brother faded and drifted away till it was just her and the Minotaur. As well as this happening, Moore's player was not here, so I have not gone into the details with any of the players of Moore's visions. So I'm not going to do that here. That still hasn't technically happened yet. Um, so hopefully Moore's will show up at some point, and I will be able to catch them up. Um, Blair experienced a moment when she was very young that she didn't remember, when the group was somewhere in Warden or Aldebaran. It was vague and hard to remember. The Varian Traders Guild seemed to come under attack from a monster, some large worm-like creature, and in her panic, not entirely unlike what she's done recently in the campaign, she seemed to unleash a breath weapon onto the creature, to almost pitiful effect, but it definitely got the creature's attention. At which point, the warriors of the guild, the protectors, the guardians, those who are skilled in the guild, rushed forward to defend the creature while everyone else pulled back to safety. And it was at this point that Blair was pulled away by a man. Slowly she fought against the sort of mental blocks and got a good look at this man, this very bizarre man whose face she could remember but name she couldn't place. And a woman joined him, the two of them speaking to her quietly, trying to calm her and aid her confusion. And while she was succeeding in the saving throws against whatever was trying to consume these memories, Blair was finding themselves unable to succeed against whatever the woman was doing to her in the past, in these memories. And she felt them once again get blurred and erased and put behind a wall of pain and agony. This sort of dull throbbing in her head. Um, Geez, is that everybody? Was that all of the visions? Moors, Ryok, Aesir, Kieran, Nyx, Blair. That's everybody. We did it. It was at this point um, that several of them woke up. In fact, I think everyone except Aesir managed to wake up. Um, Having experienced these visions, but not really understanding them, or really even having a memory of the vision. They just experienced this dull throbbing in their head, this pain, basically. Because if you suddenly lose a memory, you're not going to remember losing the memory. It's not like they lost their name or their skills or their abilities. It was just moments or people in their lives. Something that you're not always constantly thinking of. Um, and they woke up in this large cavern, um, almost surrounding or sort of pinned in a corner by this disgusting red ooze creature with skulls littering its body. And they noticed the sort of anglerfish goo coming off of it to create the body of that farmer they had seen with the cattle. For those of you who are also paying attention to the Frontier campaign, it was not my intention to use a very, very similar monster in both of these campaigns so close to each other. Um, when the group decided to go to Lapita and I was populating the Sky Island, um, this was included, and it ended up becoming a good plot hook to get people out of the city proper, just something for them to be doing where the NPCs have the time to sort of deal with how they are waking up, and could give Ryok a distraction from their father. It was one of many potential routes I had, or routes, for the party to go in Laputa. Whereas in Frontier, their interaction with this type of creature was very much like the first major encounter they were supposed to have. Um, the frog was supposed to just be the issue to that, the intro to that campaign. Um, so yes, the party ends up fighting this Ooblex. I don't know how it's pronounced. Don't rightly care. I think it's one of the coolest monsters just ever. Illithids and the things illithids make are pretty fucking cool, alright? I cannot tell you how many times I've just spent going through the history of all of Dungeons and Dragons and all the weird things illithids have made, and just going, man, what if an illithid did this to this creature? Wouldn't that be sick, nasty bullshit? I'm a huge fan. I think they're just an excellent villain, and they're not actually a monster type I've really used before. Um, Normally, the monsters in my campaigns are people. They're just player characters, basically, or greater, who have achieved power and who are, for one reason or other, antagonistic to the main group. That's usually my preferred way of doing something. I find that it makes stories that are a lot more relatable if the monster everyone is fighting is someone. It might allow for a better story to intertwine between the heroes and the villains. Um, but I'm also a big fan of monsters. just in general. And the illithids are definitely growing on me. So at this point, the session devolved into a fight um, with this Ooblex creature. Um, and it was a pretty rough fight. They were having a rather hard time of it. Nixandra was yo-yoing health extremely quickly. I think they had to use 2 potions and receive a healing spell in the span of like 4 rounds of the fight. Moors was actually doing some insane damage using Fangwire two-handed. Um, they had discovered that non-magical weapons were kind of just bouncing off of this thing. So instead of dual wielding Fangwire and his hand crossbow, which is sort of what his character's built to do, he just decided to two-hand it because I was in control of him, and that was just a smarter choice. And he was doing like almost 30 damage a round with his extra attack feature, which I don't entirely think the Demon Blood Hunter needs on top of all of its other abilities, but whatever. Um, that's just between me and Matthew Mercer. And so they had a pretty good fight. And at one point during the fight, this creature managed to consume some more memories while attacking Nixandra, blasting her with a bit of psychic damage and robbing the memory of their Minotaur bodyguard. So that memory they had experienced before with them on the coastline, looking at the ocean and just taking in its beauty, now was them doing this alone instead of with her brother and her bodyguard. Um, and when an Ooblex eats the memories of a figure with its attack, I I heavily modify any monster I use for my D&D sessions to make them either more unique or more cool, depending on how much of a big boss I'm having them be. And technically, in the Ooblex, even the Elder Ooblex monster sheet, the only way for them to permanently consume things out of someone is normally to kill them. Um, but my Ooblexes have a different ability to foster and consume memories as long as the target is in an unconscious state. They are able to literally make them amnesiac towards very specific things. Um, which is fun because it adds the story of the party trying to get those memories back, which usually involves killing the Ooblex. As the Frontier team figured out as they ended the previous session with the killing blow, those memories they lost aren't going to be gone very long since they vanquished the creature. The same can't be said for the Calimare group. The Ooblex, after taking a bit of a taste from Nixandra, gets the ability to sort of gain a bit of Nixandra's proficiencies, or languages. And Nixandra is a rather unique homebrew race. Something in my setting that is very, very rare. And that gives her access to a set of language that is also exceedingly rare. And the Ooblex is intelligent enough to realize what it sort of stumbled into. Um, and as the fight continued and it was starting to lose rather handedly, it was dealing a lot of damage. And at one point, Acer did get woken up. Uh, Blair took a run out of the cavern to try and get away from it to put some distance and realized that the cavern just opened up to sheer cliff face going down to the ocean of cloud below. Um, though it was doing a number on them, it was very clear that regardless of all of its defenses and abilities, the fact that it's fairly limited on the amount of attacks that it can make, even with legendary actions, which I admittedly was not using the entire encounter, because I'm still like really new at DMing higher level D&D 5e stuff. I'm just not very familiar with lair actions and legendary actions as a DM because normally my campaigns end at around level 5 because, attendance issues or whatnot. I very rarely in 5th edition have had a chance to get to a point where the monsters have a lot of access to these actions that help them combat a party through the action economy. I'm starting to get a little bit better at it, and I'm going to start designing more monsters that focus on legendary actions and whatnot that make sense to try and make these bigger baddies um, actually be a threat to a party. And I think I did a pretty good job at this. Now, to be fair, this creature's CR is a bit higher than what the party's dealing with, though I also technically nerfed some of the creature's stats for the fight. But it got to the point where Nixandra was barely alive. Um, and it was knowing that it might not survive the next round of combat. And I was put in a very difficult position as the monster. Is it hungry enough for the knowledge that it garnered from Nyx to be permanent? To risk another onslaught from these adventurers? Or would it use its spell-like abilities, because it hadn't really cast any of its spells yet. There were so many on them so quickly that it decided to just bash through a few of them, knock a few out if it can, lower the numbers, and then potentially cast spells. But with all of their healing, no one was really going down permanently, or at least not in a extended fashion. And eventually it decided it would be safest to flee. So instead, and it really pained me to do it because it really wanted to keep feeding on Nixandra, it dimension doored straight up to the surface of the island. Um, Moors, after this point in the fight, quickly ran over, grabbed Blair, and flew her up to the surface in case they could give chase to it or finish it off while it was wounded. But by the time they had got upstairs, it had already either moved far enough away to be out of sight or dimension doored away again. Um, though it called out a menacing sort of call to Blair, implying that it had found at least several of them extremely delicious. Um, a sort of taunt or hint foreshadowing that more would be to come. Wounded, shaken, vaguely aware that something's wrong in their minds, the group of them decided to just try and find somewhere safe. And through the forest, they could, with Moors flying up into the trees, as the trees are very large. Most of the trees in this area are about 150, 200 feet high. Um, as again, it's a forest on an area that's just very much built for the cloud giant inhabitants. And above the skyline, once he got high enough that he could sort of see further out, he could spot what is known as Frehala, which is the Hall of Magic or Sorcery. A tower roughly the size of the Empire State Building that exists within the forest, which Riok had explained to them before in the past when they had spotted it from a distance, was a sort of hall of magic and sorcery, a place of learning, a school, maybe? Riok's information is not entirely accurate, because of reasons tied to Riok's very isolated childhood. So the party began to move that way. And they eventually, jumping a few rivers, making their way along, did get to the base of the tower. Um, they did a bit of a loop on either side, but noticed that, oh, excuse me, but noticed that two rivers at least seemed to come out of the tower, like pouring out of the stone. And the rivers were wide enough that they didn't want to try just swimming across. And they couldn't find any doors or windows or balconies. So they were a little stuck, and eventually one of them just went up and decided to knock on the stone, which ended up summoning someone, a very deep blue-skinned cloud giant whose hair and body seemed constantly swept by the wind, sort of exploded into the air behind them, traveling in a flash of lightning, and wielding a spear that the tip was shrouded in thunderclouds. And she very aggressively demanded to know their purpose. Over the whirling winds and the maelstrom that was quickly forming around them, they called out about how they were working for the Jarl, working for Sokar, um, and how they just needed some help. Um, and this figure seemed inclined to disagree with that assessment, but ever a calmer giant appeared, uh, marble skinned, wearing very long white robes, armed with a rather menacing looking scythe, or sickle. Sorry, it was a sickle. And dissuaded the confrontation, believing that they would believe them, or at least think that it'd be more prudent to look into the matter. The party then learned that these two figures uh, were uh, the owners of this tower. As they were bringing, oh, sorry, as they were being brought inside, they were introduced. Oh, I dropped a bunch of stuff. I'm so professional. Was the thing I dropped the one thing I need? Oh, it definitely looks like it. All right, you're gonna have to forgive me. I only remember one of these giantesses' names off the top of my head, and I just misplaced the book like a dumbass. So they learned that the blue skin giant's name was Freya, and that she was the one who constructed this tower. Um, the pale skin, the marble one, turned them all into air and pulled them through very, very fine porous holes in the stone, bringing them into this study. And once inside, everything seemed medium sized, which was interesting because Freya was nearly 30 feet tall. She was large even for a cloud giant, whereas the other one was much more average height. They spoke for a while, and Freya confirmed with Sokar what had happened. Uh, and Sokar said that he would send someone to pick them up in the morning, to escort them out of the forest. And so the giantesses, who they discovered were a couple of some sort, or at least seemed to behave that way, had created this building, and they were sent. Freya was going to escort them to a guest room. And as they were moving through this building, Ryok in particular discovered that everything appeared medium was some sort of magical warping of perspective, and that everything around them was in fact giant size, but it's like when you see something far away and it looks quite small in comparison. Except they were seeing the very small thing and experiencing the very small thing as if it was very small, even though it appeared to be directly next to them. It was warping perspective, and it really began to hurt their head to think about it. They were eventually led into the center chamber, uh, and a stairway of storm clouds formed up in this beautiful garden, which seemed to be flooded with natural light, even though it was very close to just full dark outside. And inside this beautiful chamber, where they could see three large ponds and waterfalls, possibly lining up with the rivers they had seen outside, they saw a flurry of giants. Many different looking female cloud giants, all trapped in the rows of crafting or arcane sorcery, divine sorcery, using magic. And during this walk, they asked a bit about this place. And Freya basically said, because they brought up that they thought it was a school, and Freya clarified that it wasn't an academy. They don't have professors. This place that she built was merely a safe haven for women, and it was a place for them to pursue their passions and be safe and kept safe. Um, for those that, for whatever reason, seemed to seek isolation or just to be apart from the world. And that many of them ended up dabbling in magic. And if they wanted help, others here would be sure to assist. But it wasn't a proper school. Nixandra and Kieran both seem very intrigued by this. This sort of safe haven. They were eventually pulled upstairs and into the room where they spent a bit of time talking amongst themselves, trying to figure out what had happened. And it was here that they began cluing in that some memories were missing, as some of them were remembering things that others didn't, such as Magnus or Sin and Rosmaran. It became very clear that they had lost memories. Except Blair. Blair didn't really gain or lose anything, having succeeded against the Oobleck's attempts to consume any of her memories. Um, and the memories that it was trying to consume were something she couldn't remember to begin with. So Blair actually wasn't missing anything, technically. Not anything new, at least. Eventually, the party went to sleep. Before all of this, Nyx had mentioned to Freya that she might like to visit more, learn more of this place, and they set up a way that they could communicate, uh, or at least get a hold of her should that desire happen, and they have the time to do such a thing. So they all went to sleep eventually, and woke up to a light rapping at the door. After a bit of conversation that morning, they went and opened the door, and it was Luther sent to collect them. And that was where we ended the session. I'm sorry this is late. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please hit me up. I'd love to go into a bit more detail, but again, my notes just fell across the goddamn room. And also, I immediately have to go record Frontier, which is also late. And I need to do all of this before the rest of my day happens, because I, of course, have overtime tonight, as it's the last week. They're doing a bunch of bonuses for overtime and stuff. Uh, so, yeah, I want to thank everyone for coming. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the comments, and I'll reply to them to the best of my abilities. Still out.